audience of the National Museum of the Surface Navy Battleship Iowa Scuttlebutt podcast, broadcasting live aboard the Battleship Iowa in the Associated Foundations Training Center. And joined here in the room by no other than IT Dave to my far left, Nuts and Bolts Mike to my far right, Captain Roundup / Prince Vespa to my direct left, Kyle.
That might stick.
And
Ice Queen.
We've got the Ice Queen, none other than our producer, Moran Fangler. And we are joined virtually by a special guest today that's got a background in some of the history, especially pre-Pearl Harbor diplomacy and the role of the Navy. Dale Jenkins, who has recently written a book, I think coming out soon, called Diplomats and Admirals. Of course, I didn't say who I was. I'm Jonathan Williams, none other than the Large Ego Award winner.
You need no introduction.
None whatsoever. Everybody knows that voice. So let's go ahead and get right into it today. And Dale, as you can tell, if you haven't listened to our podcast, we're an odd group of people that work too much and sometimes go a little off kilter, just as a forewarning. But why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself, Dale?
Well, I was an ROTC student and was commissioned in the Navy, served most of the time on a destroyer. So I'm part of the Tin Can Navy alumni. And since that time, I've been active in business and banking, mostly in real estate. I spent 5 years at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York with extensive experience in international relations there. And since that time, I've been working on a book, Diplomats and Admirals, which it really focuses on 1 year with a lot of background bringing into it. But 1 year from July of 1940 until June of 1941, which includes about 6 months of what turned out to be failed diplomacy, our inability between the United States and Japan to avoid the war that broke out. It all resulted in Pearl Harbor. And then from there, we had 6 months, as described in Diplomats and Admirals, of naval action, culminating in Coral Sea and then Midway. During that period of time, even though the United States was at war with Japan and with Germany in the total Axis forces, the entire war was Navy because we had no way of putting Army troops anywhere, either in the Pacific or in the Atlantic, until later in 1942. So it's all about the Navy for the first 7-8 months of the entire involvement in World War II. And this is what I cover in the second half of my book.
So Dale, what really got you interested in that topic out of curiosity?
Interesting question, because I've been thinking of this for a long time. Every year we have a celebration of D-Day, June 6, 1944. And I have every respect for all the participants in that. I have great respect for the sacrifices that were made. And there's no way to detract anything from that effort. However, I have said to people, you're 2 years and 2 days late. By that time, unless something really unusual happened, we were going to win the war. We knew it at that time. A lot of people were going to be killed, but we were going to win the war. In 1942, that was far from clear. And the turning point of the war was Midway, June 4th, 1942, 2 years and 2 days earlier than D-Day. And so I wanted to explore as much as I could about Midway and learn what happened there, and realize that we had snatched victory out of in the last few moments. It was far from a clear victory, but what led into that took me all the way back to how we got into the war, all the negotiations that went on between Japan and the United States that culminated in Pearl Harbor and then followed through with the carrier actions, including the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, and that led into Coral Sea and, of course, Midway. So, in effect, I started in the end and worked my back to the beginning.
If we look at, 70, 80 years ago in 1940 as something that you studied, 40 to 41, today, how would you relate those lessons today and those lessons learned, and how would you communicate, I think, over to those serving in our Navy today, the diplomats, and even everyday Americans to understand how this all ties together and why it's even important to our nation?
It's a tough subject. I don't think there's an easy answer. I think it's having a constant mix of people and having diplomats visit armed forces commands, having naval, Army, Air Force, Marines, and so forth taking active roles in diplomatic events. Sure, we have Marines in every embassy. I don't think they're involved very much in the diplomatic work. It's a constant effort to have not only education but interaction. There's no substitute for it.
Well, and I think you talk about that interrelation between diplomats and our military, which some of that actually happens during Fleet Week, and even some of the events we do here aboard is trying to facilitate those conversations and those relationships. How does that, I guess I'm coming from an everyday American standpoint, how does that affect me? I mean, I know that sounds almost ignorant, and I know how it affects me, by the way, but how would you say that affects the voter, the person that is putting our congressional members or senators in office to consider budgets for our armed forces, consider appointments for those that may be serving as ambassadors overseas or in some kind of diplomatic role? How would you explain the importance of that to the person that may not understand that?
Well, we have, it's even more difficult now than it was during World War II and even for some period afterwards. We have an all-volunteer force now. And my concern, frankly, is that they've become somewhat isolated to the general population of the country. We're now at the end. We just saw the other day the last Medal of Honor winner died. A man 98 years old.
Woody Williams. Herschel Woody Williams. Yes, what an amazing man. Yeah. And he was Iwo Jima.
Foundation and so forth. There were people like me, people that served for several years and then came back into the civilian population. And as a result, there were large numbers, millions of people that had served at one time and then came back into the civilian sector. But they still had that experience. They still had that background. They had that point of view. There was, in effect, an interaction that went on. And my concern now is that with an all-volunteer force, with more people making careers of the service, it's more difficult to have the interaction that we need. One of the things that I've been very pleased to see is more veterans of the armed services actually running for public office. The last time around, and the candidates that have already announced, there's a lot of them that are running for public office, and I think that's a wonderful thing to see.
Yeah, I would have to concur with that. As a veteran myself, I've often expressed the concern that we are creating a caste society, those who have served in the military and those who have not, and that gulf seems to be increasing. When I came home from Gulf One, the phrase "thank you for your service" really meant "I'm really sorry what I did to your dad in Vietnam when he came home." And I think that's morphed into something else where it's still appreciative by much of the population that uses it, but it's also like saying "bless you" after you sneeze. It's an automatic response to somebody who has served in the military, and it serves almost to drive the gulf wider, to say, "Oh, you're one of those, and I'm not." And it's an interesting concept. I used to fight with my dad, not fight, argue. My dad served in the 50s, and is a big proponent of compulsory service, and I have always been a big proponent of an all-volunteer force. But the points that you make are extremely valid, and we see them today. And I'd be interested on your thought on how do we fix that?
How do we fix that? Well, you're doing one thing right here. This podcast with people like us, including me and so forth, can get out and at least contact some people. It's limited. It's difficult. I wish I had answers to it, but I don't. I'm hoping that my book will get enough publicity that people will see the need for it, because it's all laid out there. Roberta Woolstetter, a historian in the 1980s who received an award from President Reagan at the time, she lays out the gap of communication that occurred that led to the disastrous decisions at the end of November in 1941. It was we had an agreement with the Japanese that they would withdraw from southern Indochina in exchange for a resumption of oil. That was in place, and it was kiboshed by the Chinese, Chiang Kai-shek and Madam Chiang, who wanted the United States in the war on their side, which is exactly what happened.
I think this is...
Nobody realized at the time that a war between Japan and the United States, in the long run, China was going to be the big winner. And here we are today, 80 years later. China is the big winner in that war.
This is powerful stuff too, because so many people, when they look at World War II, they just look at the battles, they look at the actions, they see how many battleships are sunk, but they don't really understand the background, the geopolitical background that really occurred. And oil was a powerful factor, of course, in the Western Pacific, and it was a huge issue for them. And natural resources were a major problem for the Japanese. And you look at things happening now, there's real problems with oil, and there's real problems with natural resources, and now we're having a real challenge. So I think I commend you for actually addressing this diplomacy side. I think it's fascinating. Some years ago I read Richard Massey's books, Dreadnoughts and Castles of Steel, and the geopolitical stuff was absolutely stunningly fascinating to me, and it was amazing. It really outlined how battleships and the surface navies of the world in the early part of the last century, which was in fact the first arms race of that century, really came to be. People need to pay attention to this stuff, and it's not really being addressed. I think today's problems really are an echo of what's happened before.
Yeah, and I think it's really that's what we're trying to do is raise that awareness that this continues. Where I think as we get further away from World War II at 80 years ago, and as I like to say, my parents' population, Civil War was 80 years before, I think 85 years before. And now we're looking at my kids that you got that same, that same distance. And I think as a population, we have a lot of lessons learned, yet we're still despite World War II being officially over, if we look at the what's going on throughout the world with Russia and China and some of those dynamics, it continues. I mean, in my opinion, we're continuing some of those issues, and it's interesting to watch. And I think we should even revisit in future podcasts on this, Dale, if you're interested in doing that.
Yeah, sure, we can do. We haven't talked about the Japan-U.S. negotiations that went on over a period of the 4 or 5 months at the end of 1941. there were complicated relationships. We had poor advice being given to Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, by somebody named Stanley Hornbeck, who was in turn advised by Alger Hiss, who really turned out to be a Russian agent.
Oh my God.
He was only ever indicted for perjury. It wasn't clear until after he died, which I think was in the 1990s. And after that, some documents were released by the Russians that clearly showed he was a Russian spy.
Wow.
And he was the one that was advising Hornbeck, who in turn was advising Cordell Hull. And they saw that a war between Japan and the United States would benefit Russia. Well, it turns out that Russia wasn't the great beneficiary. It was China. The war between Japan and the United States benefited China.
This isn't over, too.
Japan controlled, through their expansion earlier, 50 years before World War II, they had taken Korea, they had taken Mongolia, parts of Mongolia, which is different makeup than it is today, and the island of Taiwan. That was the Japanese Empire. Had they never gotten into a war with us, they would still have that. And that would have offset anything that China was doing. And that's what, of course, Hiss, Hornbeck, and Cordell Hull put in place. And the failed diplomacy, November 26, 1941, when Cordell Hull delivered the ultimatum to Japan, set all that in motion.
Yeah, this isn't over yet. 20% of our semiconductors come out of Taiwan.
I'm sorry?
20% of our semiconductors come out of Taiwan right now.
That's right.
This is not over.
This is very, very important situation.
And next week we'll have the Director General of the Taipei Economic
Well,
here too.
And I think we're
amazing.
seeing in our economic conditions right now, with not just the inflation situation, but the supply chain issue, and watching. I think there has been a little bit of things that hit the news, but it's relatively unknown. Some of the secondary sides of supply chain. Some of the factories over in China that are starting to reduce manufacturing, or retail that's reducing purchasing. We continue to see a semiconductor shortage. We're really, and I'm not sure the American population understands what kind of situation we are from a geopolitical situation right now, and how significant it is.
It's playing into the whole strategic situation in the Pacific. China recently launched another aircraft carrier. Now they have 3. 2 of them are kind of obsolete, but still serviceable. The new one has the magnetic catapults, just the way we do on our Ford class carrier. So they're not lagging behind there. Other countries are building aircraft carriers. And you talk about the surface Navy. Very frankly, I have questions about aircraft carriers. I know this is going to run counter to the thinking in the Navy, but I think that the surface Navy, through missile launching from cruisers, and submarines, may very well be the future of the Navy. I think just the way carriers superseded battleships, I can see a situation where carriers, even though they claim they've got defenses, when you think about hypersonic missiles, 5 times the speed of sound, coming from multiple launchers, from shore-based islands, which the Chinese are expanding into now. It's hard for me to be convinced that we can effectively defend carriers. This is a very controversial statement, but I still have questions.
Well, RIMPAC kicked off yesterday, and the number of unmanned vessels that are out in RIMPAC this year. I read an article, this morning or last night about this is really, I think, one of their first impacts. They're deploying unmanned vessels at a significant number. And I'm once again, I'm not sure folks understand they're utilizing them in secondary roles, but we're starting to see a larger fleet that a good chunk of it's going to be unmanned.
When I was down at Megarust, ASNE had on the cover of their recent, normal publication, nothing but autonomous vessels, period.
Autonomous vessels are the disruptive technology. They're the thing that's going to change
Pacific
stuff.
is going to be a hot area.
And
It's going to be a hot area. And we don't know what's going to happen, but it's going to be a mix of diplomacy and armed forces. The Navy is going to be very important, whether it's aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, or submarines. There's going to be a lot that's going to be happening out there. And we have to have that interaction that we've been talking about between our diplomatic efforts and the armed forces.
So I would say as we probably went over our normal time, and I think this has been a pretty good conversation, Dale, and I think we'll start digging into it because I think you kind of helped us, at 8 or 9 episodes in on podcasts that we've been goofy all this time. We really actually started taking on serious topic here, and I think it's given us some focus and guiding light for where we need to go for it. And so with that being said, when does your book come out?
November the 1st.
November the 1st. And are you going to sell it on Amazon? How do people find it?
Yes, I'm sure it'll go on Amazon.
Yeah,
Yes.
make sure you send us a link and we'll get some publicity out there for you.
And as we get closer, maybe another couple months out, as we get closer to November 1st, let's have another revisit and see where we're at from a geopolitical situation at that point and how to connect it back to the 40s.
I was saying in the beginning, my first cruise as a midshipman was on the Battleship Wisconsin. So the Iowa, I might be familiar there. I'd be willing to come out there if you wanted to do something in person. I'd be willing to come out and look at the Iowa and remember what the Wisconsin was like.
That might be fun. We could probably do a book signing.
Yeah, do a book
that'd
signing
be
and maybe do a live feed and with an audience and across the podcast as well, and that could be a fun thing to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. So Dale Jenkins, right? I got your name right. Good. Dale Jenkins' book is Diplomats and Admirals. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for really digging into a conversation. I think it's important for our listeners to hear.
DaleAJenkins.com.
DaleAJenkins.com. Great.
DaleAJenkins.com.
Awesome.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us. And to our listeners, send us some feedback at podcast@labattleship.com. For those of you listening, we actually watched the number of downloads and engagement that we received to try to help put together content that you want to hear. So we're trying different content, and let us know what content you want to hear so we create or get with folks just like Dale to come out with stuff that you want to be involved in. With that being said, thank you all, and we're going to sign off here from the Battleship Iowa.
Thank you, Dale.
Thank you, Dale.